They laughed the loudest the day my father told the room, "Chloe Sanders will never survive where real pilots belong." No one defended me. Not him. Not the men who had trained beside me. Not the people who knew exactly what I had lived through. Their silence cut deeper than the words. It told me I wasn't just doubted, I was disposable. What none of them knew was this: the very thing they used to humiliate me was the same thing that would one day make a general stand up, salute me, and reveal the call sign they tried to bury. New York sat beneath the wings like a sheet of hammered steel when we descended through the winter haze, 6 months away. And the salt-bitten air still felt the same as it hit my face on the ramp of the C-17 Sharp, cold, and honest in a way people rarely were. I stepped onto the tarmac, boots sinking into the thin layer of frost that had settled overnight, and for a moment I just stood there, letting the weight of being back settle into my shoulders. Fort Hamilton had changed. Or maybe it was me. The place buzzed louder than I remembered, more jets, more crews, more strangers brushing past without a second glance. The hangars glowed like massive furnaces, swallowing people and spitting them out in rushed clusters. Somewhere inside, laughter erupted from the newly arrived F-22 squadron, the kind of laughter that made the air feel tighter, as if it had been pulled into a circle I wasn't invited to. Inside the briefing room, I slid into the last metal chair along the back wall, my coffee long gone cold. No one paused to acknowledge me. They rarely did. To most here, transport pilots blended into the background, a necessary but forgettable blur. Evan Ryder caught my eye from across the room. That faint, unreadable half-smile told me he recognized me before he pretended he didn't. I looked toward the wide glass pane beside me. My reflection stared back, slightly distorted, softened by the fluorescent light overhead, a reminder that returning didn't necessarily mean belonging. I was home, just not the kind that lets you breathe. By the second morning, I'd settled back into the rhythm of the base, the kind that never truly slows down. I walked into the operations center, expecting nothing more than the usual chaos: coffee-stained reports, clipped conversations, and exhausted analysts staring at too many screens. But the moment I stepped inside, the air felt sharper, charged. A NATO alert had just come in. A surveillance drone had picked up an encrypted transmission over the northern waters, one that didn't match any Allied signature. Chairs scraped, keyboards hammered, someone muttered about corrupted data. I moved toward the projection wall, almost out of habit, slipping into the room the way I always had, quiet enough that most people barely noticed. The code danced across the screen in uneven pulses, each rhythm a little too familiar. For a heartbeat, something inside me froze. Then the recognition came all at once, cold and precise. I knew this pattern. I had lived this pattern. My voice came out lower than I meant. Has anyone tried reversing the chain? A young officer, eyes locked on his monitor, barely acknowledged me. We've got it under control. Just stick to your transport duties. But as minutes passed, one algorithm after another failed. Frustration flickered across the room. Someone swore. Another slammed a pencil against the desk. I stepped closer. No invitation. No permission. The code shifted again. My mind moved on instinct, counting intervals, tracing the hidden cadence beneath the interference. I stripped away the noise layer by layer until the message cracked open. Not a mistake. Not a glitch. A deliberate signal built on the exact architecture I'd once worked against in a mission no one dared mention. The room fell into a strange hush behind me. When I stepped back, Evan Ryder was in the doorway, staring as if he'd just stumbled onto a puzzle piece he didn't know he was missing. Surprise wasn't the whole of it. Suspicion always arrives just a second later. He took a slow breath. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "Sanders." I kept my eyes on the console, grounding myself. Not here. It was all I would give him. All I could give. But the shift in the room was immediate. Conversations dipped into whispers. Heads turned. People who had never cared enough to look at me twice were suddenly watching. And even before I left the ops floor, I knew word would spread. It always did. Night had already settled along the coast when the order came through the secure line: report to General Hartman's office. Immediately. For a moment I wondered if it was a routing mistake. The general didn't summon officers like me, but the message repeated. And soon, I found myself standing outside his door, heart ticking a little too fast. Inside, the room glowed in muted blue from a tactical map sweeping across the far wall. Hartman didn't waste time with greetings. He slid a black folder toward me, thin, heavy, unmistakable. Resting on top was a silver insignia I hadn't seen in years, one tied to a version of myself I'd buried long before anyone here met me. His voice broke the silence. The signal wasn't random. They're back. The floor felt as if it tilted beneath me. He didn't need to explain who he meant. The past I'd been dragging behind me had finally caught up. He leaned forward, lowering his tone. I know the unit you once belonged to, and I know what happened to it. My pulse thudded hard enough to echo in my ears. That information was supposed to be locked away forever. He tapped the folder again. Your last mission isn't finished. The walls seemed to close around me. All the things I'd sworn I would never return to shifted under my feet. Hartman stood straighter, his silhouette cutting through the blue light. When the time is right, I will call you by the name you once answered to. The unspoken title hovered in the air heavy. Waiting. I wasn't ready to hear it, but readiness didn't matter. The past had already found its way back. Tuesday marked the first full simulation of Northern Eagle, the kind of scenario that usually boosted confidence rather than broke it. The F-22s took the lead as the blue team, while our transport group stood by in support roles, meant only to simulate emergency extraction and supply drops from the TAC Ops floor. I watched their radar signatures slice across the screen. It took less than a minute to see the problem. They were flying hungry, reacting to every flicker instead of interpreting the field. Electronic warfare punishes that kind of flying. 7 minutes in, the first aircraft was flagged as compromised. By 12, the blue team had collapsed entirely, 2 marked down, one drifting outside the safe corridor like he'd flown straight into a trap. The whole map bled red, and the room erupted. Someone cursed. Someone else smacked a console. Even the lights felt harsher. I pressed my fingers against the metal edge of the screen. Their failure felt like déjà vu, an echo of a disaster I had never outrun. That was when Evans stormed in, heat rolling off him as he jabbed a finger in my direction. You loaded the wrong tactical support files. That's why they got shredded. My jaw tightened. Support files don't pull triggers. Aiden Clark shoved forward, face flushed, voice dripping contempt. There she goes again, acting like she knows more than actual combat pilots. A muted comment behind them cut through their noise. I didn't need to hear the whole thing. The tone said enough. I ignored it. I focused on the radar instead, because they're faint. Shifting was a distortion I recognized instantly. Not a system hiccup, not pilot error. A decoy pattern, one I had seen before, in a place no one here had clearance to discuss. I leaned toward the radar operator, lowering my voice. Do you see that tailing interference at 213? He glanced up, eyes narrowing. Only high-level tactical pilots catch that. I didn't answer. The truth sat heavy in my chest. The shouting around me grew louder, but the distortion said more than any of them could. Someone had manipulated the simulation, and whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. Evan closed the distance between us, frustration twisting his expression. Stop pretending you understand warfare. My reply came out calm. Too calm. I understood it long before this room ever did. The silence that followed cracked through the air like a pressure shift. For the first time, they didn't know how to look at me. By afternoon, the hallways had quieted, but the tension hadn't. I stepped out of TAC Ops only to freeze at the sight waiting for me. My father. He stood rigid in his old flight jacket, the Alaska Squadron patch still clinging to the sleeve. His expression carried no warmth, only expectation sharpened by disappointment. I heard about this morning, he said. They gave you a simple task, and you still failed. The air thinned, not because of his words, but because I'd heard them before, on a day I never speak of. What are you doing here? I managed. Observer, he said. Here to see if you deserve that rank. Before I could answer, footsteps approached. Evan stopped beside him, wearing that thin, knowing smirk. Did she ever tell you, sir? Her entire unit disappeared on a classified mission. She was the only one left. My father's stare cut sharper. Is that true? It wasn't accusation. It was confirmation of every doubt he had about me. It wasn't my fault, I said quietly. He didn't soften. He only sighed, heavy and final. Don't drag others into what you couldn't fix. The hall felt colder. The radio echoes from years ago rose in my mind, panic. Static. Explosions. Then clarity struck. I turned to Evan. Who told you about that mission? He only smiled. Someone inside the system had leaked what was meant to stay buried. Someone wanted my past to surface. I walked away, leaving them behind. One man who'd commanded me, one man who'd raised me. And in that moment, I understood Northern Eagle wasn't a training exercise. It was a warning. By the next morning, the TAC Ops floor still felt bruised from yesterday. A scrape on the wall, a cracked headset on a console, and the kind of stiff silence that made everyone glance my way. Then pretend they hadn't. I ignored it all. My focus sharpened the instant I saw the flashing alert on the main screen. The signal had come back. A third time. Stronger, clearer, unmistakably deliberate. I sat at the radar station, and before the operator could even adjust the filters, I recognized the cadence vibrating through the interference. It wasn't random noise. The pattern had been tuned with precision, mirroring the exact sequence my former unit used when preparing to breach contested airspace. Whoever sent it knew I would understand. It wasn't just an intrusion. It was a call direct, intentional, and meant for me. Across the room, analysts argued about faulty links and miscalibrated sensors, but none of them saw the choreography beneath the chaos. I almost said too much when the pattern shifted again. They're running a chain strike sequence like I bit the sentence off. I wasn't ready to speak that name aloud. Aiden overheard enough to smirk. Like that famous unit you supposedly brought down, dozens of eyes swung toward me. I held his stare. That unit didn't collapse on its own. And it was never famous. Silence closed in. Suspicion thickened. I felt the room recalibrating around me, not out of respect, but wariness. I left before the whispers fully formed, heading toward the maintenance bay. A reflection in a window caught my eye. I stopped, studying the tension in my own face. If someone was using that pattern, two possibilities existed. They knew I survived, or someone else had survived too. Either one meant the leak wasn't accidental. It meant trust was a luxury I couldn't afford inside this base. That evening, my secure device pinged with a message, Hartman, bunker level, now. The bunker's cold metal walls vibrated faintly with the hum of generators. Hartman stood alone in the glow of a massive screen. Watch, he said. The drone footage flickered, and through the static, a pinpoint of light pulsed in the exact rhythm of the encrypted signal too precise to ignore. I felt my stomach drop. That's a message. He nodded. And it's addressed to you. The past I'd buried was no longer knocking. It was inside the room. If you don't intervene, Northern Eagle collapses from within. He warned, war doesn't wait for your permission. I knew that better than anyone. Hours later, the base felt eerily subdued. Even the loudest pilots kept their voices low, as if sensing a shift they couldn't explain. Out on the flight line, I saw my father standing beside Evan Ryder. Their laughter died when they noticed me. Evan's tone was cold enough to crack. How many people have to die before you learn? My father's disappointment cut deeper. Facing your past is fine. Dragging others into it isn't. They didn't know the truth. Everything I'd done had been to protect them. I met his gaze. You know, I wasn't the only reason that mission ended how it did. He said nothing. A soft alert summoned all pilots to the main briefing hall. When I entered, whispers rippled instantly. Spectre. That's her real call sign. Someone had leaked it. Evan, a TAC Ops officer. My father, before I could untangle it, the rear doors opened, and General Hartman walked straight toward me. Each step felt like a countdown. He stopped, raised his hand, and saluted. Spectre 1, he said. Your clearance is reinstated. The mission is yours. The room froze. Evan stared. Aiden trembled. My father lowered his eyes. As I stepped onto the podium, my voice felt steadier than my heartbeat. Northern Eagle is facing an enemy none of you have seen, and I'm the only one who survived them. In that moment, I wasn't what they assumed. I was what they needed. Spectre 1. The briefing room was filled to capacity, air thick with anticipation and something sharper fear. The overhead lights washed the space in stark white, turning every face toward the front as if we were gathered for a verdict. I stepped to the podium, the same place I'd avoided just days earlier, and felt dozens of eyes lock onto me. General Hartman stood beside me, voice steady and absolute. We are not facing a routine simulation. We are confronting the tactics of the mercenary group that wiped out the Spectre unit. The reaction rippled fast. Aiden slowly lowering his visor to hide his widened eyes. Evan stiff in his chair, and my father clutching the armrest until his knuckles turned pale. Then Hartman delivered the blow that shifted the entire room. Spectre 1 will command Northern Eagle. The silence that followed felt heavier than the announcement itself. I unrolled the operations map, the red and blue markings glowing under the light. They're executing a dispersed triangle breach, something only one group has ever perfected. My pointer traced the northern corridor. That same group killed my team. A hush swept through the room. I didn't survive because I outmaneuvered them. I survived because I recognized what they wanted us to miss. I turned to the full assembly. They're not targeting the simulation. They're targeting Northern Eagle and using you to test their next move. Hartman reinforced it with one sentence. No one else here understands this fight except her. I straightened, grounding myself. You're not the enemy. But if we fly the way we flew this morning, this exercise becomes a mass casualty event. The tension crystallized into focus. Begin the operation. Spectre 1 will lead Red Air. The moment the simulation boots engaged, the room shifted from routine exercise to something far more brutal. This wasn't a video game. This was electronic warfare rendered with enough accuracy to bruise your mind, if not your body. Red Air, my team, took formation as the aggressors. Blue Air, led by the F-22s, held the defensive line. They still didn't realize what I was about to show them. I wasn't recreating an enemy tactic. I was recreating the one that had ended my unit. The sky lit up with simulated heat signatures as we closed distance. 12 minutes was all it took for the cracks to show. Evan's jet was the first to be tagged and knocked out of the scenario. Aiden drifted off formation, losing his wingman slot entirely. Blue Air's communications scrambled into static, their radar smeared with layers of crafted interference. Every move they attempted was met by a counter they'd never seen before. Aiden's voice cracked over the radio. We're being set up. She's using banned tactics. My response stayed level. The enemy doesn't follow rules, not the ones you're used to. I slid in behind him, holding his tail for a punishing 40 seconds an eternity in combat. Then, calm and deliberate, I released the shot. Check your 6. Lieutenant. Aiden blinked out of the sim. Evan fell shortly after. A third pilot disappeared a minute later. Blue Air collapsed exactly the way that mercenary group had intended all those years ago. When the simulation ended, the debrief hall felt colder than the bunker. I dimmed the lights and pulled up the radar footage, letting the patterns speak for themselves. This isn't cheating. This is real combat. And if today had been live, every one of you would be gone. I marked the returning signal, the one that had followed me like a shadow since the drill began. They're testing Northern Eagle, and they're making sure I see it. I let the cursor hover over the pulsing pattern. This isn't random interference. It's a reminder meant for the only survivor. My eyes met my father's across the room. Me. He looked away, hands clasped, stripped of every argument he'd ever thrown at me. Cheat. Hartman stepped forward, voice carrying through the stunned silence. Without Spectre 1, the breach would have happened in the first phase. The room fell still enough to hear the air conditioning hum. The truth was no longer hiding, not in the signals, not in the sky, and not in me. By nightfall, the base had quieted, its earlier chaos reduced to distant echoes. Along the flight line, the C-17s rested under pools of amber light, their shadows stretching across the concrete like calm giants waiting for dawn. I walked the painted centerline slowly, letting the cold New York wind push against me, filling my lungs with the familiar bite of jet fuel and ocean air. Evan and Aiden stood off to the side. No remarks, no bravado, just two men humbled by the truth. They dipped their heads, a silent acknowledgement, an apology neither one seemed able to voice. My father waited near the perimeter fence, his flight jacket whipping in the wind. He parted his lips as if to speak, then closed them again. Whatever he wanted to say wasn't ready, and I no longer needed to pull it from him. I didn't approach. I didn't retreat. I simply stood between what I had been and what I was becoming. General Hartman found me there and handed me a blue folder, its weight familiar. NATO had issued New Orders Electronic Warfare Command, Rapid Deployment. His voice softened in a way I hadn't heard before. They need Spectre 1. I turned toward the aircraft ahead of me, the same model others once dismissed, the one that had carried me through battles and back into myself. My fingers brushed the silver insignia in my pocket, its edges warm from my hand. Climbing the ladder, I paused at the top and looked back at Fort Hamilton one last time. I am Chloe Sanders, and I am Spectre 1. The engines roared to life, the hatch sealed, and the future opened beneath my wings.